Good morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Hey, Andrea. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's program, a partnered program with Writer's Block, featuring a conversation with author Jill Lepore, Professor of American History at Harvard, and moderated by politics professor Dan Schnur. I'd also like to thank Scripps College for coming on board today as a community partner. Both the Council Town Hall and Writer's Block are providing our live streams for free as a public service, which is why we need your help to keep our organizations going so that we can continue to give you these quality programs like today. Please stay tuned for just a minute at the end of this program for information on how you can contribute to both organizations to support these programs. For those of you who would like to ask questions, we will be taking them in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica Duganzik, who is the Council's Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Andrea Grossman. Andrea is the founder, CEO, and president of Writer's Block. Andrea, I so much appreciate our partnership on these programs with the audiences and the quality of the speakers that we get together. And I just thank you so much for all that you do in your leadership. And with that, let me turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I'm so grateful to you at the LA World Affairs Council and to Scripps for joining forces for today's event with Jill Lepore and Dan Schnur. There once was a time in American society when we didn't know that there was such a critical difference between shampoos, or that we desperately needed that new one on the market. Political races were similar too. Jill Lepore's new book, If Then, shows us how America fundamentally changed in the late 50s in terms of the way we think and the way we buy, thanks to a small company called Simulmatics Corporation. It was run by a charismatic visionary and staffed with a bunch of eccentric data guys from MIT and Stanford. The forerunner to Google, Facebook, and to Cambridge Analytica, Simulmatics collected data on its computer called the People Machine, predicting human behavior in thousands of different situations, from buying that shampoo to voting. There are dark sides to all that data, though. Throughout the book, we wonder how different would our world be without that oddball data, that bunch of oddball data guys at Simulmatics. To buy a copy of Jill Lepore's If Then, visit either Writer's Block's or the LA World Affairs Council's website to lead you to Chevalier's books. I urge you to read it. Dan Schnur knows politics writ large and discusses it twice a week for the LA World Affairs Council. Besides teaching at USC and at Berkeley, Dan is a co-founder of the LA Times Statewide poll. To hear and see more of his great programs, turn into the LA World Affairs Council programs he leads. Thank you so much. I am so glad to present Dan Schnur and Jill Lepore.
Andrea and Kim, thank you so much. And thank you to all the rest of you for joining us today. I know you're just as excited as I am for this conversation with noted author and historian Jill Lepore. Like many of you, I've been reading her books for a long time, and my personal request was that instead of an hour to discuss just her new book, we devote 1 hour for each of her books, and that was vetoed very decidedly by both Andrea and Kim. So we will get out of here by noon as opposed to at midnight. Jill, we're very, very grateful to have you with us today. And I'm eager to get started to talk to you about this new book, If Then, how the Simulmatics Corporation invented the future. And if there's a little bit of time, I'm also hoping that we can go back to at least one of your previous books, Our Truths, because as we navigate such a difficult and divisive landscape in America today, I know we'd all benefit from hearing your thoughts again from that perspective as well. But what I'd like to do to get started is what struck me about this book is how little there is new under the sun I mean, here we are in 2020, and the news is filled with stories about how social media companies are mining our data for their use and profit. There's a ballot initiative that Californians will be voting on this November, Proposition 24, on the subject of data privacy. And of course, the international debate over who will control TikTok's user data is raging as well. But this book makes it clear that this isn't a new discussion. In fact, it's one that's been taking place for some time. So I guess what I'd like to do, Jill, if we can, is start with the history to talk a little bit about Simulmatics and what they were doing so many decades ago. And then if we can, leap forward and move this discussion into a contemporary time and talk about how these same issues are still so vexing for us today. So maybe we can start out with the basics. What was the Simulmatics Corporation? What did they do? And why did you write a book about them?
Sure. Thanks, Dan, so much for doing this. It's a real pleasure to get the chance to speak with you about these issues. And thanks to the co-hosts as well, and for everyone who's taking the time in the middle of their day to support these organizations and to think about this history. Yeah, there is nothing new under the sun in the sense, but I took on this project. I stumbled into it, and then I felt compelled to do it because I get the sense that I'm not alone in feeling really powerless in the face of the ways in which I know that my data about me is being collected and manipulated, and I'm complicit in that. Like I've literally agreed to the terms of service under which that takes place in most but not all instances. And one of the ways I feel helpless about it is not really understanding how this came to pass. Like it seemed kind of like a slow accretion of invasions, really. And as a historian, I just generally find that if I can figure out where something that I don't like that's going on began, it can help me to imagine that it might one day end and maybe how it might one day end. So not that there aren't, 1,000 wonderful things going on that is being done in the tech sector, or that is being done by data scientists at research universities, but the nefarious stuff that goes on with disruptive innovation in the field of electioneering and other realms of kind of opinion manipulation really does concern me. So I came across this. So the Simulmatics company was founded in 1959 in New York, incorporated as a for-profit organization by an advertising agency guy named Ed Greenfield, who had his own advertising company that did political consulting for all kinds of candidates. He had worked for the Adlai Stevenson, his firm had worked for the Adlai Stevenson presidential campaign in 1956, particularly in California. They opened up an office in San Francisco. They briefly had an office in LA, in fact. Stevenson really needed to win California to get the nomination for the Democratic Party. And it was controversial because he had lost the election in 1952 against the Republican Dwight Eisenhower. And the Democrats had not, especially Stevenson, had not taken a stronger position on civil rights. So winning California was complicated. There were a lot of Black voters in California. So Greenfield put together a team of people. He's kind of like the Danny Ocean of this company, kind of pulling an Ocean's 11, a kind of dream team of behavioral scientists and computer guys to come up with a way to conduct a computer simulation of the election in order to give the Democrats advice really about civil rights. The work that they do, which they dub really just as a PR stunt, they call it the people machine, is a very interesting social science experiment, and Greenfield believes that it can be used in many other realms besides elections. And so they, until the company goes bankrupt in 1970, they work in many different realms. They try to convince people to switch brands. They do models of simulations of consumer choices. They do a whole lot of work for the Department of Defense in Vietnam. They work for the New York Times. They kind of try everything by way of predictive analytics, and they just can't get it really to altogether work because of the state of the technology, really. And so the company goes bankrupt.
Okay, so decades before we'd ever heard of Cambridge Analytica, these same discussions were going on. And even back then, I think many observers understood what a big deal it was for a computer to be able to mine our data in order to analyze our lives and our preferences. In fact, the term that leapt out to me was the term the A-bomb of social science. That's pretty seminal.
Yeah, although that was a boast. Like that was supposed to sound like a great thing. That was a game changer technologically to be able to run a simulation of an election. I mean, people said at the time, in fact, Lou Harris, who was Jack Kennedy's pollster, said, come on. I mean, it's basically just public opinion polling, like at a fast clip. Like it's really not that new. That's just a bunch of, snake oil they're selling you. But it was new. It really was quite innovative. What really stopped me in the tracks, Dan, just as you say, is the people at the time who both knew that it was kind of a big deal and were really worried about it. So my favorite character in the whole of the book is this University of California, Berkeley political scientist named Eugene Burdick, who's like fascinating for 10,000 reasons. He's like a world famous scuba diver. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He was a hero in the Navy during the war. He's a novelist. He hangs out with Marlon Brando. All of his novels get made into films. He's always in Hollywood. There's like a profile of him in the San Francisco Chronicle. It's about like how during his office hours the girls just line up down the hall. He's crushingly handsome. Anyway, he works for Greenfield in 1956 for the California primary for the Stevenson campaign, and then is asked to work for this new company, the Simulmatics Corporation, and declines, but goes on to write a novel about it, which is an indictment of this work. It's kind of a bad novel, but it's also kind of great, like in the bad good way, like the good bad movie. It's called the 480 because the Simulmatics model involved breaking the electorate into 480 possible voter types. And so Burdick writes this dystopia that's published in 1964 about how there's this computer company meddling with our elections. And he writes this preface in which he says, I know these guys, like this is a real thing. I know these guys, I've worked with them. They're nice guys. Like this, they're not trying to harm anything. Like they're just really like slide rules and computers and punch cards. And I don't think they realized that they could possibly destroy American politics as we know it. It's 1964. He's a smart guy.
Well, and it's fascinating because on one hand you have Burdick, and I should say, by the way, that my experience teaching at University of California, Berkeley has absolutely nothing in common with his. Just as a disclaimer before we go on.
You're not always playing doubles tennis with the co-eds?
No, I'm not, and I don't know who we'd list as the modern day equivalent of Marlon Brando, but Johnny Depp and I do not hang much.
You don't? No, yeah.
But look, to me, it's fascinating because on one hand, you have Burdick talking about the potentially cataclysmic effect of this type of approach. On the other hand, you have pollsters of that era dismissing it. And what I've read, and Jill, correct me if I misinterpreted it, is that this project in many ways started out as research you were doing into public opinion polling. For those of you who haven't read it, Jill Lepore wrote a phenomenal piece a few years back for the New Yorker called Politics and the New Machine. And so maybe this is a good way to bridge from the past to the present. Here we are, 41 days from an election with this obsessive focus on polls. And you've come to what I think is the correct conclusion that data analytics are a more effective and more accurate measurement of people's not just consumer but political tendencies. Tell us how you how you come to that conclusion.
Yeah, so in 2015, a lot of things were happening with polls, as no one would know better than you, and in the industry, where the response rate had really plummeted and had been falling since the 80s, partly because of cell phones. It was just hard for pollsters to get a high response rate, and there had been many efforts to address that problem and to aggregate polls. But meanwhile, data science or data analytics firms were really competing very well especially for being employed by campaigns to do campaign polling. And increasingly by media organizations. Is kind of the post 538 moment when it was like very sexy to be like doing the latest kind of data journalism polling stuff. But meanwhile, so it seemed by many measures that polling, which had become a much more profitable industry, was meanwhile becoming less reliable paradoxically, and yet more relied upon. So one of the things that I note in that piece from 2015, but that remember when there was that, it was like, was it 17 people who were running for the GOP nomination in 2015? At some point, I think it was 17, and they had to do, the undercard and the kids table and the grown-ups table, and the first of the debates was going to be hosted by Fox News, and Fox decided to use an average of 5 polls to figure out who would be in which of the 2 debate stages, and then on the main stage, this where everybody would stand, and not only that, but the frequency with which they would be asked questions. So based on those polls, Donald Trump stood in the center and was asked the most questions. At the time, a number of reputable polling organizations refused to participate. Pew and Gallup, NBC, Wall Street Journal, all refused to participate in using polls in this way. They'd never been used that way before to seat people at a debate. So my piece was really an investigation of the history of public opinion polling, which has many points of controversy along the way. This is how I came across the story of the Simulmatics Corporation, largely through Burdick's indictment of it. But the indictment that I actually found to be most compelling, which actually is quite similar to Burdick's critique, is a book written by a political theorist named Lindsay Rogers in 1948 called The Pollsters. And Rogers said, here's among the problems with polling. It's kind of gotten out of hand. And now we're doing all this horse race polling, which is very different than doing public opinion survey work, right? Like asking people their views about things. It could interfere with the process, but what it also does is it is causing the decay of our institutions of community. In that, and this was Burdick's argument even more fully, that if we as pollsters and especially data science companies do our work by segmenting the electorate into voter types by demography and neighborhood and economic status and race and partisanship, in order to not just to predict elections, but to tell campaigns what message to give to this kind of a voter and what message to give to this kind of a voter, then we're acting as if we live in a political system in which each voter is supposed to vote in her own best interest and without reference to the public interest or the common good. But in fact, we live in a republic with a lowercase r where we actually are all supposed to be thinking about one another and about our communities, and not just about, I as a Catholic white woman from New England who's voted Democrat, like that shouldn't determine my personal attributes as a voter, shouldn't determine what I think is best for everyone. That the act itself, the segmenting of the electorate in that way and then providing direct messages is inconsistent with our system of government and will in fact transform the system that we have into something that we don't even want. And I think that's a pretty strenuous critique of data analytics work in particular. Because I think that most Americans have really lost sight of that notion that your obligation as a citizen is to think about everybody's interests, not just your own.
Okay, so just that statement alone leads to between 40 and 50 follow-up questions, most of which I'm not going to. But I think you make a series of terrific points. For those of you who participate in our Thursday webinar, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, you know that we talk frequently about how polls are not supposed to be used to be predictive. And this is exactly the criticism that Jill mentioned about them being used for the setting of the debate stage in 2016. Rather, they're designed to give insight into why people believe what they believe, but not necessarily to predict an outcome in advance. But your point about the data analytics to me is especially interesting, Jill, not just as it relates to politics, but more broadly for consumers. In other words, we're essentially making a trade-off, and you alluded to this earlier. On one hand, I'm getting something for free or for low cost, and I'm getting something tailored to my interest. Netflix suggests to me movies that they think I might like. So on one hand, I'm saving money and I'm getting convenience, but the trade-off for that is providing them with information, not just about my purchasing habits, but my reading, my viewing, and you could even argue my thinking tendency. Talk a little bit, if you can, about the nature of that trade-off, could you?
Yeah. Well, one thing I think it is important for us to recall is that, and one of the things I spent a lot of time trying to excavate in the book is that this was in fact anticipated. So the chairman of the research board of Simulmatics Corporation was a political scientist from MIT named Ithiel de Sola-Pool. Brilliant, brilliant guy. And in 1968, he wrote a series of essays predicting the future, because it's kind of a big thing. Like, it's the year that 2001 comes out, the Kubrick film. People are really interested in 68, like, what will the world look like in 50 years time? And in one of these essays, he says, surely we will have personalized newspapers by the year 2018. That will be 50 years in the future. And that would be it would be really nice to be able to just only be provided with the news that you want. It'd be in a digital format, and you'd probably get it in a device that you could hold in your hand, and it would be super convenient to get information in that way, only the information that you really care about. But on the other hand, I think that might destroy the party system, because how would people have a sense of a community of interests with people, especially across a coalition, a political coalition, when they're experiencing their news in a hyper-individualized fashion? I mean, he's entirely right about the consequences of that. But just to say, I mean, obviously he was a very forward-looking person, but it's not as though this wasn't anticipated even a half century ago. So, but you think about that, like when I was growing up, I just delivered the newspaper in our city, and I remember when you would open, there'd be the front page with the national news and the local news and some AP stories and then you'd open up the newspaper, and there'd be, remember these like kind of half-page display ads? It'd be like, there's a Memorial Day sale at Sears. You can get your Maytag washer for $99 with a dryer for only $150. And that Maytag, Sears and Maytag could advertise in a city newspaper because everybody needs a washing machine. I mean, even renters might be telling their landlords, the washing machine's broken. I hear Sears. Like, it's not even just homeowners, right? But advertising messages had to appeal to a mass audience. Like, that's why it's called mass advertising. So not that, I mean, it's not awesome to be sold washing machines all day, but when I'm online reading the newspaper now, I'm going to get some very micro-targeted ad that is about my demographic. And I mean, I can't even think this would be like, fashionable new eyewear for intellectuals from Cambridge. Like, I don't know what it would be. Like, trying to think something that would be sufficiently non-self-serious, but like there'd be crap coming at me that really only I'm going to see, just like the news. And I think when that first began to happen, maybe we were a little bit more aware of it, and our kind of antennas went up and said, wow, I'm getting some really customized stuff here, and I should be worried about that. But it's now so naturalized, and I think for younger people, which a lot more than half the population is younger than I am, this is the only way they've received news and advertising. And so, just it's a kind of succession of things that chip away at a sense that we belong to one another in any meaningful way. I mean, you could make a much bigger argument about secularization, and there's all kinds of decline of community arguments out there of the kind of Robert Putnam variety, and those go pretty far back. But I do think the kind of profound alienation of hyper-individualism as something that is being done for profit is really different than a gradual cultural tilt. This is a business plan.
And whether it's being done for commercial or political or cultural reasons, ultimately the impact is the same. As many of our viewers may know, Google decided that in this year's presidential election, they would not allow the so-called micro-targeting by racial and ethnic status in order to avoid both those, just the types of divisions you're talking about. But you make a particularly good point. This will be my last question before I turn this over to Jessica and to our audience. Jill, you mentioned in passing about how young people tend to be more comfortable with this trade-off because this is something they grew up with as opposed to something the rest of us have had to adjust to. Is there a way to explain why this trade-off might not be as alluring as it seems? Or is this something that we're simply going to have to live with and navigate going forward, or both?
I remember a few years back, I was working on a piece for the New Yorker about the history of the kind of crisis of journalism. I wrote a piece called Hard News, and I was trying to explain in the piece about native advertising, on like BuzzFeed or some sites where there are stories that are in the same font as stories that are actual news or opinion pieces, but that are just ads. Many Americans are enjoying Jamaican holidays lately, and it's a travel service ad, but it's disguised itself as a news story. And I thought, this is so patently fake. Like, who could? And I sat down separately with two of my kids and said, like, let's look at this page together, and you tell me, is there anything here that raises an eyebrow for you? And nothing. And then I said, well, let me tell you, some of the stories on this page aren't stories, they're ads. This is like a clue. And neither of them could figure it out. Like, it just wasn't visible to them in that way. Like, it seemed glaring to me. So I think the idea that we can somehow ourselves figure out that, like, because then I had the discussion, like, now that you know that, is it worth it to you to visit this site, knowing that this stuff is being sent at you? And meanwhile, if you click on this stuff, data about you is being collected, and you think this is where a free place to get your news, but in fact, you're paying the price of having all this other crap come at you. I don't know. I'd be curious whether the audience has views about this, but I have not had a lot of conversations with young people where they get exercised about that. I taught a freshman seminar last year on the history of technology, and all my students pretty much said, the privacy horse is out of the barn. Like, there's no, you can't fight it. Like, you might as well just really enjoy the stuff that gets sent to you. Like, I think they, and there's many benefits. So I think it can be hard to, unless you can imagine an alternative, which I think for most people is difficult to do, whether it's a micro payment system, or there's 1,000, kind of proposals on the table for ways to stop this and regulate it. Unless you can really imagine an alternative, it's hard to make the case for how to stop this.
Well, and just last thought before I turn this over to Jessica. As I was preparing for this interview, I found a wonderful column written by Nick Kristof, the fine New York Times columnist, back in the early years of the internet era, long before social media. And it was a column called The Me Network. And he was talking about this this phenomenon, particularly in a political context, which is fitting as we head into the home stretch of very difficult presidential election. And what he talked about, and this gets back to your point about the individual newspaper for everyone, he says every one of us now has our own television news network, and we can set it up so we never receive any information, opinion that disagrees with us or that challenges our opinion. Rather, it reinforces what we believe and congratulates us for having the good sense to believe it. And what I hear you saying is that, as challenging as that is, when consumers are aware of that trend and setting up on their own, it's much more insidious when it's happening without their awareness and knowledge. And again, you've talked about this in a consumer and cultural standpoint also, but as we head into the home stretch of this election season, I'm wondering if you can address it specifically from a political standpoint, and then we'll be eager to go to our questions.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we're all kind of trapped in the silicon cage, and you can't even necessarily see the bars any longer. I thought a lot about how I wish there were a kind of national stage for someone who could speak and bring into American political discourse a rhetoric of commonweal. I mean, I think Cory Booker tries to do this. This is one of his kind of go-to, like he has a kind of pastoral care way to talk about politics and the kind of healing thing. So maybe if there were a stage for him in a way that was not about seeking a higher political office. I mean, I'm not some huge Cory Booker aficionado, but like, I actually just don't think there is a national stage anymore, right? Like so for, like, think of the platform that Martin Luther King built for himself, and that the people who were out on the streets struggling with him and as high as possible, that, and built that platform so that come the day, when he speaks at the March on Washington and the National Mall, the whole country, really even the whole world, is able to listen. We don't have that. We don't have those platforms anymore. There just aren't. And some people actually need to be heard. They need to be heard by everyone. And they're not even, if you even trying to sort of speak to a large group of people about anything to do with American politics, you're really, I think, early on funneled to, one stage on the left and one stage on the right. There is no platform in the middle, and it's very hard to speak across that distance. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote My History of the United States, These Truths, was to try to offer up an account of the nation's past that, while not exactly being a bridge, could try to at least put some planks down on that platform. Yeah, so now I forgot the question, but we should go to other questions. So I lost my train of thinking.
I'll simply note that, to your last point, one of my favorite quotes now has become something that you've written, which is to study the past is to unlock the prison of the present. And you're right. If we all occupy different platforms, all view the world through our own personal lenses, and perceive different versions of what ought to be a common history, the likelihood of us being able to come together towards some set of common goals becomes pretty unlikely. I think ultimately, and this is something I talk to my students about, it has to be something that individuals do willfully. That conservatives, they need to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. I tell my liberal and progressive students they need to read Bret Stephens or George Will once a week, because if you don't do it, the algorithms that you've been talking about, Jill, simply aren't going to permit it. All right, Jessica, I've monopolized this stage far longer than I was allowed to, and I hope you'll forgive me for that.
I was enjoying it. I'm sure the audience was enjoying it as well. So thank you so much.
I will give up this monopoly, and we can now turn it into a broader conversation.
Thank you. Professor Lepore, I'm glad you also mentioned these truths. Our first question is about that. The questioner says, you drive home the centrality of race in understanding our checkered past and present. So I would appreciate your view on the 1619 project undertaken by the New York Times. Thanks so much for the program.
Sure, yeah, it's a great question, and I have an entirely unsatisfactory answer, which is, it's a true confession. I don't really read a lot of history unless I'm required to for something that I'm researching. So I actually have never sat down and listened to the podcast or read the 1619 essays. I tend to read a lot of fiction at night. And I'm usually going from assignment to assignment writing. So it's not like I've gone out of my way to avoid it. It's not like I've tried to avoid it or something. But I think it was a brave project for the Times to undertake. I think it would be fair to say that the Times' own coverage of American history as a matter of scholarship and publishing has been pretty limited in my lifetime as a scholar. So I think it was a real breakout moment for people at the Times who had different voices to bring to bear, and I think it was really important and provocative. I got a lot of press inquiries when there were various controversies about parts of the project, and I pretty studiously just said no comment because I've not actually read it. So I kind of really have to basically say no comment.
Well, as some of our audience is pointing out, how much you accomplish, and this next question says, your research is so wide-ranging. As an aspiring historian, I'm curious how you orient yourself when you begin a new project, given that you've written books on topics ranging from King Philip's War to Wonder Woman to data analytics. How did you begin your research for If Then, and what were some of your key sources, archival or otherwise?
Yeah, I'm an archive rat. I love spending time in the archives. So I generally begin with the archives. Usually, as in this case, I find something in the archives that leads me to believe I should write about it. So I found the Simulmatics Corporation does not have corporate archives. The company went bankrupt and everything was pretty much destroyed. But I happened to be looking at the papers of the chairman of its research board, which are at MIT, and there was box after box of stuff. And so I just kept reading through it, and I really like writing about stuff that no one's ever heard of before. So there's more discovery involved. It's the kind of historian's equivalent of a scoop. You know, if you open up an archival box and you can tell no one's been through it, it's like, you know, when you buy a book and the pages haven't been properly sliced, they haven't been knifed, and you're like, I'm the first person to read this book. It's like exciting. Or you get a book out of the library and the call slip is pristine. It's like just exciting. Like, so I love that, and I will go pretty far with a project where I think there's fresh discoveries all the time. Like, I watch my dogs chasing the smell of a rabbit, and I'm like that. Like, I'm pretty dogged. So yeah, so I read around a subject. I try not to read too much, actually, because I don't like to be too influenced by just to make sure that there isn't a lot that has already been written about this. And then I just paw through the archives and paw through the archives. In this instance, I did a lot of interviewing. The principals are no longer with us, but their children are, and there was a kind of family story, a domestic story that I wanted to investigate. Spent a lot of time talking to the children of the Simulmatics scientists and business guys. Tried really hard to track down women who worked for the company, especially Vietnamese women who worked as translators at the Saigon office. And then I'm a pretty determined outliner. I will say I have on my, if you Google how to write a paper for this class and my name, you'll come up with this like little 2-page handout that I give. I don't think I give it out anymore, but I used to give it to my students. It kind of explains how I go from thinking about a problem to writing an essay that makes an argument about it while telling the story. And so I would kind of recommend that, or else I'll just continue to blather about how I work.
That sounds incredible. Okay, we've got a couple of questions about your book. Did Simulmatics use algorithms from a UNIVAC computer to develop their data?
So no. First of all, it sounds like it must be this big, gleaming, glossy, skyscraper and glass headquartered company. Simulmatics was a tiny, struggling kind of band of brothers operation. They didn't own their own computers because hardly anyone had computers when they started in 1959. At no point did they have their own mainframe computer. The original work was done on an IBM 704. There was one at the IBM Service Center in New York. You could rent time on it. And over the course of the coming years, there was also one at MIT. MIT had a computer center that had I think a single IBM 704 for a long time for all of the New England research universities. And, you had to get time at like between 1 a.m. and 1:15 a.m. to run a program on it. So the programs are written in Fortran. They're really short. They're quite unsophisticated. Obviously, I mean, it's a new language. It's a new technology. And they got their data. They borrowed the punch cards of the Gallup and Roper polling companies and basically retabulated all the public opinion polls that Gallup and Roper had done from 52 forward.
Interesting. In the 1950s, communism was prevalent in this country. Were any of the developers of Simulmatics communists?
No, they were pretty straight, white liberals. They were Cold Warriors, all of them. Not all of them ended up supporting the Vietnam War. It became really controversial within the company to do work for the Vietnam War. One of them, this guy Poole from MIT, he had been a Trotskyite in the 30s, as so many Cold Warriors had been, had renounced that, certainly by 1939, and worked for the government doing propaganda during the Second World War. But when he needed to get a security clearance, he was a defense intellectual before he worked for Simulmatics, before he helped find Simulmatics. He was in California at the time, and Richard Nixon was his senator, and he had to get Nixon to intervene because his sort of quasi-communist youth at the University of Chicago in the 1930s had meant that he was denied security clearance, so he had to appeal. But no, they were most of them fierce anti-communists.
Interesting. And this is kind of a policy question. Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act provides a legal safe harbor for internet companies. Should Rule 230 be amended or changed, or should the United States adopt an EU GDRP-like rules to protect the common citizen for privacy and data protection?
Yeah, I mean, Rule 230 certainly should not stay in place. What the best remedy is, I'm not, there are plenty of people who've been thinking really long and hard about that. I write a lot in these truths about how that 1996 Telecommunications Act came to be passed. And I write a little bit about it in this book as well, because that particular vision of a deregulated and unregulated and unregulatable internet derives in great part from a book written by Poole, one of the founders of Symbolmatics, called Technologies of Freedom. He came after Symbolmatics disbanded. He became something of a neocon, and was really influential in thinking through the implications of the internet and arguing for deregulation or lack of regulation.
Thank you. And Dan, you might also chime in on this next question. The questioner says, I worked at Quinnipiac polling and found that how a question on affirmative action was framed, that the answers were predictable. Your thoughts on this practice?
Dan, did you want to jump in?
Oh, Jill, I'll defer to you, and then I'll follow up if there's anything left to add. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, people who do survey research are really keen to get it right. So they do a lot of self-study to see which questions are creating problems. But then polling is a huge industry. So there's a lot of nefarious actors who are kind of deliberately framing questions in a way to elicit certain answers. The longer history of polling and affirmative action, or just broadly civil rights history issues, is pretty dark, in that George Gallup, who founded the American Public Opinion Research Institute in 1935 and is really the father of modern public opinion polling, he had a nationally syndicated column called America Speaks, and he didn't include Black voters in his polling because in most parts of the country they could not vote, and B, because he was syndicated in the South, and Southern papers did not want to hear how Black voters would vote. And they also really were uninterested in printing columns about anyone's opinions on civil rights. So for the years that Gallup dominated the polling industry, I think it's safe to say we have wildly distorted polling information because of the suppression of the political voices of Black Americans, not just through Jim Crow disenfranchisement, but because they weren't polled. I think there's a legacy to that. I think there's a lot of kind of just so polling stuff that's out there. That said, there are incredible research organizations that doing incredibly sophisticated survey research that's quite self-conscious about the phrasing of questions and does a lot of verification of its research.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly echo what Jill said. Now, from a practitioner standpoint, you can write a poll question to get any result you want. In contemporary context, I could write a poll that demonstrates, for example, that 80% of Americans think that the United States Senate should follow the prescripts of the Constitution and confirm a Supreme Court justice nominated by the sitting president. I could also frame a poll question that would get 80% of the American public to say that they oppose the idea of Donald Trump seizing the reins of the judicial nomination process in the last days of his presidency to subject the United States with XYZ. Anyway, it's an exaggerated example, but it's a great point, particularly as we head into the final weeks of a presidential election. When you look at poll numbers, like we've talked about earlier, number one, they're not designated to be predictive, but rather to give you insight. But second, look at the question that was asked. And if it feels like it's a leading question or even a rhetorical question, then it probably is, and discount the answers accordingly.
Thank you so much. This next questioner says, hi, Jill, this is Svetlana. I'm a big fan of your podcast, The Last Archive. Will it be back, and what topics will you be covering in it? Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. I had so much fun doing season 1 of The Last Archive, working with my producers, Ben and Sophie. We've had a blast doing it, and I've really missed traveling around the country to archives with them. We are doing a second season. We're pretty well into it. I think it'll be 10 episodes. It's called Doubt. The season 1 was called Truth. And it's a kind of a history of the rise of doubt over the course of the 20th century. I think it'll be out sometime in the spring. It's hard to say. Everything is complicated. But yeah, no, we're absolutely doing another season.
That's a good way to say it. Everything right now is very complicated. This next question, you say that there isn't a national platform anymore. Hasn't Trump created a model that comes close to a national platform?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, that's a very good point. He absolutely has. He's the only one allowed to stand on it, but it is, but that's what it is. Yeah. But that said, I mean, he has had a pretty I can't, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think like the number of followers of his Twitter, it's Twitter, that's his platform, really, nothing else. That's exclusively his. I don't know if the numbers of his Twitter followers changed that much since the end of his first campaign to now. I guess the other thing, I have written a bit about this, but Twitter itself is not a national platform. Twitter is an incredible distortion of the electorate. It's a very tiny fraction of Americans who are ever on Twitter, and of people on Twitter, almost none of them tweet about politics. So, and of the people who tweet about politics, 90% of the tweets are written by 10% of the political tweeters. Like, people who are on Twitter all the time tweeting about politics think that they're in some like buzzy, exciting, breaking national conversation. They're talking to like 3 people out of 300 million, as far as I can tell. And not that there's not uses for Twitter. I mean, I know people really enjoy it, but the illusion that it is a national platform is one of the biggest cons in the history of social media.
Well, on the question of social media, this next question is, what has been the impact of Facebook on politics, and what do you foresee? Can and should Facebook be regulated? And if so, in what ways?
I think Facebook needs to be dismantled myself. I think I have very strenuous views about the damage that Facebook has done, not just to political institutions, but to the institutions that support democracies, that make news available to people, that make it possible for people to live among in communities where there are differences of opinion, and I think Congress has got to stop believing Mark Zuckerberg when he says that the company's business model is to connect people to the people they love, because the company's business model is to take your data and sell it to other people, and then have them get you upset about other people. And we don't have a lot of time left for all the things I have to say about the damage that Facebook has done and the utter lack of accountability of the leadership at Facebook. I think tremendously good people work for Facebook and would like it to be a very different company than it is. I don't mean to, besmirch people that have or do work for the company. I think there's a lot of good intention there. But I think the business plan is fundamentally destructive of any possibility for a liberal democracy to survive.
Thank you. After writing If Then, do you still click agree on website prompts? Have we as a society already given up on whether we care about who controls our data?
Oh, I don't know. I still buy the sneakers when they send me the sneaker ad. Like, the places where I draw the line, I'm not on social media. I never have been, and that's not like a sacrifice. Like, I don't fundamentally understand the appeal of social media. So it's not it's not heroic to not be on social media if you think it seems like icky.
Just if I can interject a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Can you tell us if you read the disclaimers before you click the yes, I agree?
I tend to block stuff. I don't read the disclaimers, because also, are we supposed to be able to is that stuff English? Like, I don't know what the hell's in them. No, here's the thing. It's quite a bit like climate change, right? You could make a pledge to never drink a Diet Coke from a plastic bottle because you're not going to use one-use plastics anymore. But really, it's the fossil fuels companies that need to make some changes in the federal government. and we need to get back into the Paris Climate Accord. Like, it's really not, this stuff is not going to be solved by consumer choice and virtue signaling. Like, oh, it's so brave of me not to be on social media. No, it's not. Like, the brave thing would be to actually come up with a way to significantly challenge social media companies in their accountability and their transparency. So I think it's a mistake to imagine that consumer choices are where change will happen here.
Thank you. Dan, I got a question for you. Why did Dan Schnur's Dornsife poll correctly predict Trump's win?
I'll answer this quickly because this is not this is Jill's webinar, not mine. And if anyone wants a longer answer, they can tune in on Thursday mornings at 11 to Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. But here's the quick answer. The USC LA Times poll did not correctly predict the outcome of the election because we did not poll the Electoral College. The SC Times poll showed Trump winning by a small margin, and two very quick points. One, I think the value from that poll, and I should make it clear, I'm no longer involved in it, but obviously was then. Instead of asking voters whether they preferred Trump or Clinton, instead we asked on a scale of 1 to 100, how certain are you of your vote for president? And on a scale of 0 to 100, how certain are you that you're going to vote? Clinton received more support, as she did in the nation in that survey, than Trump did. But while Clinton supporters generally registered in the mid to high 60s, Trump supporters registered in the low to mid 90s. And so as we saw nationally, while Trump supporters were outnumbered, they were much more intent and much more fervent in their support. So number one, we weren't correct, but if you go back to the idea that polls are not meant to be predictive, but rather to give insight into the voters, what I did find fascinating from that survey is the point I just made. Trump supporters were more committed to their candidate in the 2016 election than Clinton's were to hers. And I would add just briefly, before turning this back over to the rightful speaker on this platform, to me, that's the most important question in this election. There aren't a lot of undecided voters, but can Biden motivate his party's base of support to a greater degree than Clinton did? And shameless plug for Thursday, to what degree will the debate over Ruth Bader Ginsburg's affect the ability of both candidates to motivate their respective bases to even greater levels? We now return you to your previously regularly scheduled programming.
Thank you. Well, and this is our final question. So this next question, in these truths, you highlight the earlier influence of Edward Bernays, a cousin of Freud's, who influenced advertising and political campaigns. He emphasized the importance of the unconscious and influence. Do you see the work of Simul Maddox, Cambridge Analytica as a logical extension of Bernays' work?
Yes, although more squarely, it's the logical extension of the work of Harold Lasswell, who was a contemporary of Bernays's, who writes a book about propaganda in the 1920s and then rises to extraordinary academic celebrity. He is a founder of Simul Maddox. He's one of the major stockholders of Simul Maddox. He's the guy who calls it the A-bomb of the social sciences. And he's kind of zealot of the company. He knows everybody involved in the company. So he's a little mysterious and in the background, but it really is his vision of how propaganda works that lies behind the understanding of human behavior that is the oil in the people machine.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Dan, I'm going to turn this conversation back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And before I thank Jill Lepore, not just for her gifts to us, not just this most recent book, but the tremendous work she's done over the years. As a reader and a fan, I think I speak for many, many people to tell you how grateful we are for the work you do for us and the insights that you provide us. But I do have to ask just one last brief question before we turn it over to Kim for the close. That is, Jill, in one of your other interviews, I read that you made it clear that you did not care for the book Little Women. And so I'm interested as to whether you like the movie any better.
I loved the movie. The movie, I was utterly distraught. I was so moved by the movie. And I also felt so lacking. Like, why did I not appreciate that beauty in this story? Why was it not a story of the courage of the writer and the artist in a time of discord? I didn't see it. I was just like, these girls and their daffy stuff is incredibly boring. I would like to go watch Star Trek. So as a kid, I just had no appetite for it. But no, I admire the movie immensely.
Okay, well, we'd love to have you back at some point, and we can have the Kirk versus Picard versus Janeway discussion for a good
Okay,
start.
let's do that. All right. Well, this was a lot of fun, Dan. Thanks so much for doing it. It's a real treat to speak with you. And thanks to the hosts as well. I've really enjoyed it. And we'll do it again someday.
Okay, Kim, the floor is yours. Jill, thank you so much.
Jill, Dan, thank you for such an informative discussion, if not sobering. And please, everybody, there's information about Jill's new book, If Then, available after this program. So get in line with me. I'm getting that book right after this program. Thank you to Andrea Grossman and Writer's Block for partnering on this with us and securing today's speaker. I'm so appreciative of that. Please visit our websites, both Writer's Block and the World Affairs Council Town Hall, and find out how you can support us so we can continue with these quality programs. Everybody stay safe, stay informed, and tune in to Dan on Thursday. Thank you, everybody. Take care.